a space like this where people are present, people come from various walks of life, various connections to hip hop culture, and there seems to be a real sense of cohesion and community around these sorts of topics. And what I just want to do is offer you some insight into what's going on in terms of like school counseling and this very, what I think is a burgeoning area of research and scholarship around the intersection of school counseling and how school counselors are prepared, and the fact that there is so little discussion around how school counselors, particularly when school counseling doesn't look like the populations in which the diversification and brownification of America's schools, public schools in particular, that school counseling could be used, school counselors can use hip hop as a way of establishing rapport, notions around empathy, and creating spaces in schools where students feel empowered to speak to the experiences that impact them inside and outside schools on a daily basis. So how many people just, I love asking this question, remember anything salient, meaningful about their relationships with their like school counselors? Like a name?
But I had a native, but I could identify them.
So typically it's the minority, like very few people can reflect on their experiences in high school, probably K through 12, and recall something meaningful about their interactions with their school counselors. And oftentimes that lack of connection, that lack of rapport has to do with the fact that there is tremendous cultural asynchrony between students of color and the school counselors that they work with. School counseling, just like in many ways teacher education, is overwhelmingly occupied by white middle class women who have very few experiences with people who don't look like them, and that heavy reliance on deficit frames and deficit language to sort of conceptualize the experiences of students of color, talking about what students of color don't bring to the equation, and how that can alienate students inside schools and make education one of those uncomfortable and non-affirming things that you can ever imagine. So I'm a school counselor educator, and I teach one class on multiculturalism, and someone can graduate from my program, get a master's in school counseling, and take one class in multiculturalism. So the burden is we're trying to educate students who come from majority backgrounds about every person that they could possibly come in contact with, and that's unfair and it's practically impossible. So what I'm trying to do with hip hop and school counselor preparation is just say, these are the things that hip hop can be used to broker relationships, and then create a space where students are affirmed, where students take ownership of that space, and they speak in a way, and I use this term deliberately, intentionally, that they can speak irresponsibly in that space, that they can speak authentically, and not worry about what the repercussions around their being honest and their speaking with candor and with passion. That place is respected, that place is protected, and they won't incur any sort of consequences or repercussions about speaking irresponsibly. So that's just a little insight into what I'm trying to do in school counseling. If you Google school counseling and school counseling literature, you won't see any intersection of hip hop culture and school counseling. You'll see it a lot in teacher education and teacher prep, but you won't see virtually anything in school counseling, which I think is absurd, but it's a place of entry. So if people have interest in school counseling or making school counseling more approachable through the lens of hip hop culture, that's the work that I want to contribute. So I tried, Dr. Domestic.
See, the Brown folks don't jack up my last name. So I was that dude that hated substitute teacher that I'm like, I'm gonna butcher it. I'm like, I'm here, boo-boo. I don't even try. I already know who you at. So my name is Dr. Arash today. I am a professor of organizational leadership at the University of San Francisco, which is where? That's right. It's like, what color is a white horse? People look at me like, is this a trick question? You playing with me, Dr. D? No, so I teach two classes. One class I teach, which is sort of dovetails on what Dr. Washington mentions. It's very intersectional between hip hop culture and youth identity formation. That class is called The Sociology of Hip Hop. So we look at all sorts of iterations of critical race theory as it parlays in the classroom. and looking at how hip hop as sort of in its semiotic and elemental spheres, from b-boying to DJing to spin verses to graffiti art to, and we can go on to activism, how those are all sort of imbued in some of the more idyllic constructs of what a restorative or emancipatory classroom should look like. And how oftentimes the operative word in activism and any sort of collective action of love, which I think is the definition of activism, right? It's collective action of love. That sort of is ownership. The fact that we don't even have ownership over our own narratives, right? Like Ida B. Wells said, they kill us so we can't tell our stories, right? Hence the names up there. And so to that end, that's sort of where hip hop has found its place in the academy, in my work, and as it sort of overlays with the work that Dr. Wash and I do together with some of our published pieces. The other class that I teach is called Campus Cultures and Environment, and that is sort of a look at the role of schools as a continuum of historical conquest and cis hetero white supremacy, and not just as one individual institution, but really as an action arm of this ideology. And so we're not just looking at skin hue, but we're looking at various proxies of power. And so there's this sort of deficit notion of empowering students that is, while tacitly it does convey positive intent. We're meaning as people from majoritarian backgrounds to support the students who will come from subaltern or invisibilized backgrounds. We are not actually giving them power. It is not a transaction. You don't give someone voice, right? You decide when you can opt in and out of spaces where you can listen to them, where you can create the conditions of a class in which that proverbial voice can be amplified. We talk about giving power, and there's power that already exists. It's just rendered inert by Anglo-normative curriculum, right? We look at just the 5th grade textbooks in Texas last year completely eviscerated the word slavery, and they replaced it with migrant workers. Hold up, last time I checked, workers get compensation. So again, these diametric contrasts are deliberate, they're intentional, and they do not abdicate schools from taking ownership and responsibility as an action arm of historical conquest. So to that end, so much of the work that I've done thus far with youth, as Dr. Nosala mentioned, I do work with a couple organizations in Oakland, Hip Hop Chess Federation, Encourage Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice. We actually have a ballot measure in the November ballot coming up that we wrote, Prop 57, which is to cleave any opportunity for youth to be tried as adults. That came out of YPAR, which stands for Youth Participatory Action Research. And our incarnation of YPAR in Oakland was based around the hip hop cipher. And so the hip hop cipher, if you do a little bit of a Google search on cipher, it's originally an Arabic word and it actually means symposium. And so it flattens out the veritable hierarchy that exists in a classroom where you have students traditionally in postmodern classrooms sit in rows and sit quietly. And I teach in the teacher ed department at USF, and I tell my students, that's the graveyard method of teaching. When I come visit your schools, you better not have your classroom set up like that. You can have it set up where we're trying to flatten out that balkanized set of power. And so if school is a surrogate for historical power, then it's important to differentiate between school and education. And when students have access to schooling outside of formal constructs of school, meaning a classroom, a desk, a whiteboard, and they can get that education somewhere else, then the power of the dominant majority becomes unmanageable. They realize that people can tell their own stories and it can actually help leverage their livelihood. And so what we did with our youth participatory action research, and I'll sort of underscore this in more detail in tomorrow's workshop, where we share some of the more practical applications of our work. Today's is a little bit more of the theoretical frameworks. Is this idea that students are the experts of their own lives, and that balkanized, that surrogate paternalism that happens in classrooms where we think it's sort of like an ATM where students come to the classroom, push a special code, that code being the Anglo-normative curriculum, they would then somehow be able to withdraw the education that they're receiving is actually a form of erasure, okay? And so what we did was we wanted to align the research that we did at Courage, the research we do in training our pre-service teachers at the University of San Francisco with what is the idyllic notion of a hip-hop cipher. Where if you go to a cipher, or if you participated in a cipher, how many have actually seen a cipher before? Okay, so people may come with some bars already transfixed in their minds, but based on, it's very bilateral and reflexive. Based on what something that someone says in the cipher, you're sort of responding, and it's very organic that way. And so the germination of verses is really based on who gets to participate. It's about who has ownership over that space. Not just the corporeal physical space, but the dialogical space, meaning the dialogue, right? Who has ownership over asking questions. Even our inquiry, if it's a proxy of power, right? Being able to question authority is in of itself a form of activism, a form of resistance, okay? So what we do with YPAR is we want to model the cipher, we want to model our research around the cipher. So when we have focus groups around systems impacted youth and we want to look at the socio-ecological manifestations of incarceration once our youth get out of confinement, we don't simply want to talk to the youth. We want to look at the entire macro system of those who have been impacted by those youth. So we're talking to guardians, we're talking to their volunteer coordinators if they have jobs, we're talking to their bosses, we're talking to their teachers, we're talking to their POs, and from there we can synthesize a more holistic picture of the impact of confinement, right? And that's really to get around this deficit notion that you can remove a troubled youth from a classroom and somehow that classroom will be more peaceful, right? Mm-hmm. Every student is a microsystem of a larger exosystem, right? Just like you can't elect the right president to create a more just society, you can't hire one teacher and assume the entire culture of a school is going to change if the conditions of schooling have not changed. And so when we talk about deficits, we're not trying to restore individual people, we're trying to restore systems. And so right now in the neoliberal claptrap, one of the, I call it gentrified restorative justice, is this idea that you can, right, or you know, more colloquially, we call it the blind side effect. Dr. Wash and I, is this white lady with an adorably patterned cardigan sweater, gonna go to the hood, right? Usually played by Sandra Bullock, someone like that. They're gonna go and save the black kid, right? Or Hilary Swank or Michelle Pfeiffer. Y'all know what I'm talking about. It comes out every December, right? Made for an airplane movie. I can't wait to see it on my way back home. Or ignore it and pass out. Yeah, so you get those movies, right? And it's this idea that this one individual is going to make up for a continuum of historical conquest. Not only is that remiss and short-sighted, it patronizes our intelligence. Right? I'll say that again. Not only is that remiss and short-sighted, it patronizes our intelligence because you cannot condemn someone, a student, and I'm going to put this since we are talking about poetry, you can't condemn a student, metaphorically speaking, for dousing water in a classroom that's constantly trying to burn them. Right? You have to think about the conditions that ignite them. And so, reasonably acting in a way that is really a form of self-defense in a classroom, you have to think about the difference between misbehavior and the constitutes of misbehavior and acting in a way in which your identity doesn't have to be sloughed off ad nauseum simply so you can stay in a classroom. And someone, albeit a teacher, and sometimes akin to the same zeitgeist as a police officer, doesn't see you as an existential threat. And sometimes those threats are seen simply by virtue of questioning the curriculum that we've been given. Okay? So I'll leave it there. Do you want to?
No, the point that you made about, because what I experience most often from like school counseling students, the students that I work with, they're coming to the classrooms ill prepared to be able to contextualize this long history, and they have very little insight around the notion of education being serving certain socio-political interests, and education being part of these larger ideological apparatuses. Like, they don't see it in that way. So they haven't been indoctrinated into like critical theory, so they don't understand, or they haven't been groomed to critique and question everything about what they're doing. So their relationship to the institution is one that they see themselves as an advocate, someone who embodies justice. And that's been probably one of the most difficult things to help them understand, is that the trajectory, the history of what we call like education in this country has been like rooted in marginalization and silencing. So, for instance, one of the frustrations that I was just articulating in class Thursday was the fact that in our intro to school counseling course, the textbook doesn't mention anything about segregation. Nothing whatsoever. So they haven't gained like prerequisite information to understand that charters and these educational programs that are situated in certain schools to entice white students to come there is an extension, is a continuation of the very contentious nature around education in this country, where people who exist on the margins are doing their best to gain access and leverage and control over the educational systems to which their children and communities will be exposed to. So this revisiting of critical theory and emphasizing how you can't understand the relationship between the curriculum, the ways in which education is constructed, the organization of the classroom, who gets to speak, who's silenced, all those different things, as part of this apparatus of violence. So, and I use those terms quite intentionally because the students don't understand it as a form of violence, that you're inflicting violence, that silence is violence. And it's just one of the most frustrating things that I'm having to undo along with my colleagues, and also the work that Dr. D and I are doing together. But hip hop, for them, they understand like, so we can use hip hop as a pedagogical tool. And I'm like, yeah, and but, right? So it's not just, hey, we're gonna get some kids, we're gonna play some music, and we're gonna use that so they can commit this content to memory so that we can still teach to the test. Like, that's not liberatory praxis, that's not what hip hop could be. You're actually muting the potential and possibilities if that is the only thing that you can use it for. The one thing that never fails when I do professional developments in Louisville, JCPS is like the 15th largest district in this country. And it never fails when I ask, what was the genesis of hip hop culture? A room comprised primarily of white middle class women will say the 1980s. So they have no understanding of hip hop as being an extension of the Vietnam War, anti-war protests, the assassinations that happened in the 60s, Gil Scott-Heron, Nikki Giovanni, the Last Poets, none of that. And so all they know is, well, hip hop is hyper-misogynistic, patriarchal, and they're talking about consuming drugs and alcohol and objectifying women. So they have that aversion to the culture because that's all they know. And when they see students walk in schools listening to this music, the belief is that what you're listening to, the culture to which you ascribe, is the barrier that prevents you from excelling academically, and that's contributing to this achievement gap, right? So, like Dr. D said, the sloughing off, I ask students all the time, like, why is it necessary that you demand that students remove this content from their ears? Like, if it's so compelling, if it's so salient, why don't we imagine possibilities or ways of using the content that affirms who they are, but then entices and connects them to the curriculum in ways that the traditional textbook just doesn't, right? In ways that it's just not designed to do. So that's part of what's going on in Louisville, at least a very, very small part. And it's not easy, it's very contentious. There's a room full of cynicism when I have these talks in Louisville. It's like, Well, no, that's the very thing that impedes them from being successful, right? So we should actually be decreasing their access to hip hop, and that would probably promote their academic success. And nothing further from the truth could be the case, right?
And thinking about sort of assuaging some of the negative images, negative according to the dominant culture,
Right.
that's represented by the institutions. And make no mistake, like, we're professors at Research One, predominantly white institutions. And so one of the ontological contradictions in our existence is that as two men of color, you know, we're trying to subvert the same thing we perpetuate in a lot of ways. We work at school systems that were founded upon desecrated First Nation land. And we're working at these nations, and we're trying to subvert the same ideology that grounded them as the superior power. And so as surrogates for resistance, that is our role. But I'm not going to sit here and self-flagellate as if I am the utopian sort of agent. I understand my role, but I also understand the contradictions and complexity of my positionality, as does Dr. Washington. And so to that end, what's important is to distinguish between healing and trauma. There's two types of critical pedagogy. There's healing-informed pedagogy, and there's trauma-informed pedagogy. And Dr. Washington, a couple times, you know, brought the allegory of pessimism. We don't simply want to enervate the colonizers' pessimism in hip-hop, right? Because if you read anything about Afro-pessimism, Frank Wilderson's work, Saidiya Hartman's work, you'll read that it's not just about this consumption of hip-hop. It's also about who gets to define the consumption, when, where, how, why, right? And the auspices in which that consumption happens. So for example, I am going to share with you a Freddie Gibbs song about corner boys in Gary, Indiana, to tell you to distinguish between positive hip hop and negative hip hop. And I'm like, you know, and this is an assignment that I give to my students. I tell them, I said, bring me, I don't want them to differentiate. I say, bring me something that you would consider to be conscious hip hop. And they're very literal. Like, they look for the word conscious on like Rap Genius. And they'll bring me stuff that I'm sure many of you have probably heard, the Brother Ali's of the world, the Immortal Techniques of the world, the Slum Villages, the Little Brothers, right? But I'm like, well, what about Freddie Gibbs? And then I'll bring some like stuff that would be considered perhaps ratchet by them. They're like, Dr. D, you listen to this? What the? I didn't know I could do that. And I'm like, well, hold on. How is this not fodder for some of those critical conversations? Because if Freddie's talking about in Effing Up the Count, he's talking about his his chemistry teacher would hide the scales because the teacher didn't think he was worthy enough to use the lab equipment, and he's using chemistry at home so he can cook the dough up, right, or cook the dope up, then again, the ownership over our own intelligence and our narratives, right? That's the message of the song. It's one of them, but it's presented in such a way in which that deficit is almost embraced as a bedrock for critical conversations that need to be happening about how did we get to this point. You can't talk about corner boys if you're not talking about redlining. You can't talk about curricular conquest if you're not talking about the Carlisle indigenous schools. You can't talk about the indigenous schools from Oklahoma all the way up to Baltimore, right? You can't talk about the Starlight tours. You can't talk about those things and then act like they're completely weaned from how we got to this point with the textbooks in Texas, right? And so I need that sort of the unsavory stuff to have those critical conversations. And so with trauma-informed pedagogy, it's a risk and a harmonic balance that we try to strike, especially with all the images that are being shown ad nauseum on the TV. It can be triggering for us because as people of color, whose conquest is constantly relived through postmodern images, right? we don't have the luxury of ever letting go because we're still living it. There is no terminal velocity or end, right, or expiration date to our conquest until these institutions are uprooted, right? And so in order to do that, you have to be able to make that link. And to make that link, it requires the symptomatic pieces of school-induced trauma, right? Hence the trauma-informed pedagogy, where you get to tell your own narrative. But what is oftentimes, I think, precluded is the healing-informed pedagogy, which is, what do we use this narrative for? And that's some of the work that we're trying to do with our community partnerships between USF and organizations like Courage, Hip Hop Chess Federation, where we'll give some grassroots organizations some tools for decolonization. Anything from youth participatory action research to focus groups to how to codify the data from your research. But from there, they get to tell their own stories. And from there, we actually got to write an entire sort of plea to many stakeholders in the state, where we have a whole regimen from garden projects to policy campaigns that we do at Courage. Something else that came out of the work that we do is some schools that consider themselves Tier 1 restorative schools, they model every classroom after a cipher. So the way that works is the counselors actually will teach a class for every grade level, where they'll sit in the class in 6th period and they'll say, okay, what did you learn today? Okay, you talked about pH levels and toxicity, and then in history you're talking about Flint and lead poisoning, and you also talked about smallpox blankets. Okay, so how are we going to connect what's happening in Flint to what happened with smallpox blankets? Okay, and then from there, what happened was we actually had our students come out of that restorative class and go and measure the toxicity levels in the topsoil around the Mission District of San Francisco. And then they presented their research to the mayor of San Francisco, Ed Lee, who we called the gentrification mayor. Okay? I'm involved for him, I don't care. And he gave us, oh, this is going to be on YouTube though. Shout out to the NSA. Yeah. Looking like rabid Taliban over here. So anyway, after they presented to him, he distributed free topsoil to various organizations that have urban gardens in and around San Francisco, as well as the families of the students who were the subjects of the initial research done by the students at John O'Connell High School, where we have a Restorative 1 program. It's not just restoring individuals, restoring the socio-ecological systems. So again, when we're talking about poisoning in Flint, we're not going to blame people for not being able to go to Costco and buy cases and cases of water. We're going to say, well, how did we get to this point? Let's talk about the trauma, but then let's talk about the healing. And from the healing, that requires us to tell our own story. That's why we wanted the students, the youth, to go around and measure the soil. So you can see how that would resemble a cipher, right? Who has ownership over the space? And the space is all sort of, it's very fungible based on the information they get in the data, right? In the same way that you would spit verses based on the information you get from the person in that circle with you, it really is a symposium of knowledge, okay? Was this helpful, or are we just like hurling a bevy of information at you? Good. Okay. Before we go on, should we take some questions right now? Or does anyone have any questions for us about our work, or contributions, comments you want to make, what's resonating with you, some blind spots or lacunas that we might have missed? You want us to talk about? Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about the structure and the symbiotic relationship that the environment of a cipher can give. Mm-hmm. Is there any other place where that sort of format is being underutilized other than like, say, the classroom or the counselor setting, or that you guys can think of? Or?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say schools are, oftentimes as school leadership professionals, we blame society for the state of affairs, the tumult that we're all subjugated to, but schools are scenes of subjugation themselves, and schools are microcosms for society. And quite frankly, we are society. And so I would say that everything that we're doing at the school level can be mimicked in other institutions. The important underpinning is, again, ownership over that space, what space making looks like, what healing means. And I think you would have a better time trying to find an albino rhino hitting the quan on a double rainbow than you would every individual in this classroom or in this room having the same definition of social justice. So we really have to find that point of convergence in terms of our purpose and what our guiding constructs, our ideology is, before you can talk about doing the work, right? That work, the precursor to that work is really our purpose. And that purpose for some is perpetuating people of color or other historically marginalized groups in a burning house. We're not trying to do that. We're really trying to reconstruct and reconfigure our orientation in relation to that house. So when we tell stories, we don't want to trigger people. We want to tell stories and really alleviate some of the chasm between the perception of youth of color as in deficit or existential dangers to society or menaces, and the reality, which is actually people are acting pretty reasonable given the conditions that they've been given, right? So how we uproot those conditions, how we consume those conditions, right? If you study Afro-pessimism, it's all brokered around this idea of consumption, right? The consumption of blackness, the consumption of indigeneity, the consumption of feminism, right? How that consumption and those images are not owned by us. So when you talk about hip hop, for example, you can't just talk about hip hop. You also have to talk about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. You can't just talk about Dead Prez, Let's Get Free album. You have to look at the cover and do a little research of what that cover represents. If you look at that cover of that album, you'll realize that it's actually an image, a striking image from the Transcontinental Freedom Movement from 1955, which is a conference that has happened in Havana, Cuba for the last, however many years, since 1955, and a lot of people haven't even heard of it, right? And it's multiple continents, and it's a youth movement, it's a college student-led movement. A lot of people in America haven't heard of it, right? And so that requires you to do some critical work around imaging. And so you can't talk about mainstream rap without thinking about who gets to define what mainstream is, which is why I talk about the Telecommunications Act profusely in my lectures in my sociology of hip hop class, because it requires people to really unpack systems and not just to the point of your question, not just to look at schools as vacuous, isolated entities, but schools really being at the epicenter of society, because you can make the argument that schools have the most variegated stakeholders of any milieu in our society, right? There's an economic investment in schools, there's an ethical investment in schools, there's a humanitarian investment, there's a market-based investment, there's a deficit-based investment to tell the story of conquest through the eyes of the colonizers' textbooks, right? But you also have the opposite, right? There's an emancipatory journalism that happens in a math classroom. When I'm teaching ethnomathematics, and I'm like, hey, you know what? Do you know the contributions of the Mayans to getting to the point where we now have the Pythagorean theorem? Like, all of these things, much like a cipher, really built off of one another. Like veritable lily pads, schools don't exist in isolation. Right? So if you read any, like Patricia Hill Collins, she has a theory of matrices of domination, in that one institution alone doesn't dominate you. It's the way that one institution's ethos is perpetuated by seeing the same image in multiple ways by other institutions. So if the banks tell you that you got to pay this to qualify for this mortgage, you have to have a certain level of credit, you've already been given this codified idea of credibility in the grading system, right? And in the attendance rates that schools have in order to get funding, right? And so this racialized economy is perpetuated by schools, but schools would not have the credibility that they have without other institutions. Do you want
I
to
think when you talked about those spaces where those resources are being underutilized, So oftentimes I think the focus is on like pedagogy in the classroom or exchanges between teachers and students or counselors, in my case, counselors and students. But I'm also thinking about, even before we talk about initiating curriculum or how education unfolds in the classroom, creating ciphers comprised of community representatives, stakeholders, actual stakeholders, and we are members of the cipher as it pertains to decision-making within the school and how decisions get executed and the implementation of things that we desire. So I think that can not only happen there at the local level, but also if we go up a level in terms of national accreditation policies and what constitutes the canon and what gets marginalized and left out of the canon could be just as instrumental. It's impossible to disconnect what goes on in the classroom from the preparation programs that put those teachers and school counselors, in my instance, in those schools with those students in the first place. So it's not just the execution of the curriculum, it's, well, how did the curriculum come to exist in the first place? And who are the people who are executing the curriculum? So I think that's a part that often gets overlooked. So it's not just the convergence between the teachers and the students, but it's how have the teachers and the counselors been oriented towards their work? How do they conceptualize their work? And that goes way back to like one of those systems that you don't typically interact with. Well, who dictates what constitutes the accredited counseling curriculum, right? And who attends those schools, and how do they then find their way into these into the schools where they work? So I think that's, at least in my reading of school counseling preparation literature, that's often overlooked.
We have 10 minutes, as my distinguished colleague just
Yeah, so why, maybe it's not really to you, but the second one, activism. So why activism not political sovereignty? I don't know if you speak to it in that particular perspective regarding hip hop and sound, I guess, in place,
Yeah.
and how that actually relative to the current Standing Rock issue, fetishization of Native America, the therefore after applications like this that aren't Native are being brought up throughout as a form of empowerment for Native America, so to speak. So how does that then, is that really activism? You're still perpetuating, like you said, the systems that are continuously, I guess, creating an icon or an ideal of what Native American looks like, or specifically a specific tribe. But for me, it's the neck or Keon. I don't know what other tribes are here, but for me, that's kind of, so I often wonder that, is it really activism, or is it the rhetorical sovereignty of that sound that you're evoking? Because now you have ad-libs, you take them up, hip-hop takes that from a lot of different indigenous tribes and stereotype it, or they use it in a way that may not have been particularly like that. Take the word white man in Navajo, Vilagana, or Adeyo Yasuke. So I would say either others say Vilagana, which means the one white man. So but we have our other side too, which is so different. So then that's why I asked the question, is it really activism, or is it really a form of speaking, of sound and place, relative to that discourse or that culture, where you come from, specifically without constructs of that society, but really saying this is how I say certain things, this is how I get across to my fellows the idea of what we're saying. Case in point, future, really, a lot of deep lyrics behind it, but there's a perpetuation if you're not thinking beyond the stereotypes that you're saying.
Yeah, the consumption.
Yeah,
That's
so.
I mean, I think that for me, I'll make this short after watch.
Altitude is
Two ideas. One, I would say that activism isn't stringently linked to just speaking. I think you can speak, as we are seeing with the pipeline activism, that people aren't speaking. It's about untethering oneself from when you are asked to speak, in that codependency on permission to speak. Even if that means that you're asked to speak, why are you here? And you're like, I'm not moving and I'm not answering your questions. So I think we also have to think about beyond this monolithic version of activism and think about it in all its elements, just like we think about hip hop in all its elements. The other point is that activism oftentimes underscores visibility, and it allows us to have a conversation, but it can also be the conversation. So when I had, 4 years ago, and activism can build on itself. 4 years ago, one of my students was tased to death by a police officer in East Oakland because he had a lisp and he couldn't actually speak, ironically. So he couldn't advocate for himself. And his dance crew, his b-boy crew, decided to post a video of them turfing on the corner in Oakland where he was murdered by the cop. And that was a form of activism. But then from there, turfing, which is an acronym for taking up room on the floor, has now evolved into a solidarity movement with other genres of b-boy dancing, subgenres of b-boy dancing, like voguing, which is coming back now, right? And so you're having people who are there's a lot of crumping and turfing and stuff, and it's usually seen as a really hyper masculine performance. Now you're having voguing imbued within that as a form of solidarity. So it's building upon itself as a black, feminist, anti-cop, anti-colonial movement. You don't speak a single word. Okay. I thought he wanted a high five. Like, from across the room. I'm that hella old dude that still high fives his students. You good?
Yeah, I'm good. You can say a few more
Did you want to say anything about activism?
questions, comments.
In Louisville, I'll just give you an example of things that I've seen recently. There's a school, Butler Traditional, if I'm not mistaken, and they attempted to enact a policy that would disallow and punish, actually criminalize, forms of ethnic hairstyles. So locks and afros, and we've seen this across the country in different iterations where, and it's deemed an act of defiance, and it's inherently criminalized. I think the language that they use is that it's distracting. It's distracting students, and within, I want to say like within hours of this circulating on Facebook and other social media platforms, there were students, there were parents, there were activists in that community, and so they weren't necessarily, they weren't only speaking against this hair policy, but the conversations were, the conversations around the hair policy understood that the hair policy was the extension of the notion that this was a traditional school. So they were taking up the idea like, well, let's unpack what traditional means in the context of segregated schools, right? So in Louisville, there's actually, you apply to your elementary, middle, and high schools, right? Just like you would a college or university, right? So your access to the top tier schools, if you don't have access or entry points in elementary school, the likelihood of your gaining access to those schools in middle and high school are virtually eliminated, right? So the students, in talking about the policy itself and how dehumanizing it was, notions around their hair being a distraction, took that and seized that as an opportunity to have a broader, a richer conversation around how our educational resources in the city being allotted, and how does the notion of a Butler Traditional School sort of reinforce these notions around conserving old platforms and old paradigms of how students of color and white majority students get educated in the city. For me, that was one of the more recent forms of activism and demanding that something change. And it also happened with regards to the ways in which discipline is vetted and unfurled in schools. So those are just two examples in my recent memory of how it's unfolding here or back in Louisville.
Yeah, because I just look at the word activism, and I just hear the word hipster, hippie, radical. So that's why I had to ask, why that specific word, another word, pop sovereignty. I don't know, whatever you want to put out there, but it just carries a certain connotation as to what the machine is actually continuously moving with. The only reason I bring that up is because when you go into a Native American paradigm, there's already certain social constructs in it, and hip hop hasn't really been accepted so much in that way, or as much as country. But I was having a conversation with a colleague here that country in Navajo, the sound is really getting to its sound. Hip hop is just beginning. I said then you take it to another level where you take dubstep and electronic and you put on a Navajo tune or a powwow tune. So you're playing with two different types of tunes on top, which one of them is really coming from a prayerful, spiritual side. So it's really interesting how music will then evolve with that touch of music on top of the other genres that have influenced it. So much
Like
for
a
that.
track called Rap.
For that.
And I would even push back and say to not with
No,
you,
that's
just
fine, that's
people
fine.
having that dialectic
Yes.
is what does hip hop sound like?
Yeah,
Because I don't-
exactly.
you know what I mean? It's relatively still in its infancy stages, and in that germination, it's constantly evolving. Dr. Washington and I actually watched a video this morning with one of our favorite MCs, Mick Jenkins, about this very conversation.
Right. So, mumble rap, I don't know if.
Y'all know what that is?
Yeah.
I've had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what we were watching was a conversation with Ebro and Rosenberg, and they were trying to triangulate and entice Mick Jenkins to essentially say that,
Denigrate his colleagues.
to be condescending towards mumble rap, and he was just like, it was a postmodern way of like conceptualizing what rap is. It's like, who am I to impose my notions of what hip hop is, and that can be very constraining and very oppressive. So, because I didn't conceptualize it, I have my own notions of what hip hop is that's informed by the rich musical traditions that I was steeped in as a young person. It would be problematic for me to then say that those people don't belong in hip hop because they don't perform it in the ways that I do.
Okay, so this is my devil's advocate position here, and it's just because of this idea of owning the space, right? And you mentioned gentrification. I'm gonna bring it in here. People who aren't traditionally in that space appropriating it.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that? So personally, my mom wears a bindi on her head, and then when Stefani did in the 1990s, I was like, because when my mom walks down the street, people call her names for that. When Gwen Stefani wears it, or Coachella goers wear it, it's like fashion. And so there's even a dialogue within my own community of like, somebody who's not traditionally wearing it, and when does it become appropriation? And I fully believe it is, but that's because of my own, it's like trauma informed for me, hearing people say shit about my mom, right? Versus somebody else who doesn't have that experience and they're like whitewashed, I would call them, and that again, that's like a form of violence towards them, telling them they're not Indian enough. But like where does that end? So you want to allow somebody to come into the space and you want to be inclusive, but when do you become inclusive to the point where you're losing your ground and your space? For example, like I work in Navajo, right? I'm an attorney there. And so I want to be a part of the community, but when does it become patronizing? When do I become somebody who's in there with this paternalistic racism, which I see in my colleagues who come in there for like a year or two and say, this is how you should do it. And then later when they're done with it, they leave. So like when do you, because you have people coming into hip hop who are talking about certain things that they may not have ever experienced ever, and they just want to, it sounds cool. And you want to include them in the space because you don't want to say to them that they can't be there, but at the same time you're like, well,
I would say he can't be there.
you would?
Yeah. Well, because I'm also looking at it from an indigenous perspective. As an indigenous person, you're going to show up in a headdress. I'm going
Right.
to call you out on that, and I'm going to tell you you have to leave.
Right.
Because that is part of my culture, and you have no space in that.
Right.
You don't even know what it means to wear it.
Exactly.
And I've even been at festivals where I've asked people to remove them. I'm like, you're standing next to me, you need to take that off. Do you even know what that means?
Yeah.
But I'm really direct.
No, so am I, so am I.
And I have tamed it down over the years, but I'm still direct.
But but that's also like a hardship for,
Yeah.
and I think maybe nuanced by the fact that we're women, right? Like
Right.
to be the bitch who's
Right.
gonna stand up and say that.
I'm that.
Yeah,
I've been
right?
called
And
that.
like how you're supposed to move through society yourself as a woman, and like
I
yet
just tell
still
people
be
take it for
an
what it
activist.
is. I tell people take it for what it is until
Right.
you have educated yourself
Right.
on that. I don't think you even have a place to argue with me about it.
I mean, I have this conversation about yoga all the time. I don't know how many people in this room do that shit, but it inflames me.
Oh, yeah. As
And
soon
like,
as you
and
started
that's
talking,
really
I was like,
unpopular for people because it's so prevalent. They're just like, well, why? Like, it's a form of health, and so it's okay if I go do hot yoga 30 minutes a day, and like, I get my body all tight. And I'm like, okay, you know, come talk to me when you learn about it, but is it mine?
Exactly.
Like when, okay, so I'm sorry. But yeah, how do you stay inclusive without letting in people, like gentrification, right? You don't want to say, no, you can't move to this neighborhood, but at the same time, you're displacing others when you move in.
Yeah, it would be like the same way if you take 18-bar concept and you put on like the whole Navajo Yeviche's actual tune beat and extend that 18-bar to whatever the sound of the meaning would be within Navajo context of sound development.
Well, that's what it is.
That's
It's being
what, like,
contextualized.
so, yeah,
Like
so-
you have charter schools like the Ron Clark Academy, where he's hit, you know, pop locking and dropping with his students, but there's no history, there's no context, and it relegates schools as an apolitical space. And for no one in this room, I'd venture to guess that the majority of people in this room, school will never be that. You can never have an unracialized society as long as we identify ourselves by giving consent to whiteness and our proximity to whiteness, because that's what othering is. And so ownership has a lot to do with that distance between perception and reality and how it's contextualized and decontextualized. But just in the interest of brevity, I will.
No, I was just gonna say, like, in those PDs, the teachers who come and they are very transparent about wanting to contribute something valuable and wanting to learn, then I reiterate time and time again that you have to be able to push aside your preconceived notions about what this is. Otherwise, you're not going to take away the content that you need in order to make some tangible difference in the lives of these students. And that's what I see, the whole centering myself, and they'll talk about, well, this is graphic, this language, but they don't put it in any historical context, and it assumes that the kids don't have the requisite critical thinking skills to unpack their relationship to the world. So it's something that we say over and over again with these programs.
Identity? Is it identity that or you're trying to unpack everything to them and let them figure it out, or is the end goal to create an identity?
No,
that they
like
want to create?
like
Like when you speak this inside, you know, what are you both getting at? Is it identity of that discourse in that region you're speaking to, or is it identity of a unification of all those ideas?
in terms of the utilization in the schools, or
Yeah, or whatever, what you've been speaking about to this point, relative to what hip hop is, and the culture of it. Is it really you're getting to identity?
yeah, which is
okay.
part of hip hop, obviously. Yeah, but with the teachers, it's like, well, no, that's the problem. Like, we need to remove that. Like, if we can remove their connection to hip hop, then we'll see their test scores increase.
Or who they were before they walked into our classroom, which is impossible. We don't want to encroach on the time of our colleagues, so we will hang around if people want to speak to us offline. Our information is also available online. We'll be here tomorrow to share some more practical applications that we do in our communities in Louisville and in the Bay Area for me. So feel free to touch base with us offline. This conversation doesn't have to end today. We can keep it going and proliferate through synergy. So don't be shy. Okay, so thank you for your time.